Hello, Minnesota. Welcome back. This is the Tony Hernandez Show. I'm your host, Tony Hernandez. Hello, are you out there, Minnesota? We're trying to get a visual feed here. We're broadcasting live from the Twin Cities, Minnesota, worldwide, SCC Television Studios here in White Bear Lake. We broadcast on SPNN from St. Paul, and our YouTube channel is Tony Hernandez Show. Today's May 18th, Saturday. Coming off another big week of news. There's more scandals emerging with the IRS targeting conservative Republican groups, not-for-profits throughout the country. And this just in 2012, our U.S. Senator here in Minnesota, Al Franken, sent out a letter with 6 other U.S. senators, including Mr. Chuck Schumer from New York. And essentially they were urging the IRS to do their investigation into different groups across the country that he was saying was engaging in federal campaign activity, essentially using his power from a U.S. Senate seat to try to influence the IRS to go after or stifle free speech and freedom of organization. And he's doing that with U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer. So that's pretty big news coming out of here in Minnesota. Among other news is the St. Paul has a number of races this coming year, the odd-year election. The mayor is coming up, and also the St. Paul School Board. So in a couple weeks, we're going to have one of the school board candidates on. His name's Chu, and in the past, we had David Martinez. And a number of them are vying for who's going to be the next school board member, who's going to be elected. So we're going to keep in good touch about what's happening with St. Paul school board races, because there's a number of good candidates here, and like I said, we have a couple of them that are going to be coming on in future broadcasts. So more news today is this week Governor Dayton signed into law the freedom to marry in Minnesota. Gay marriage is now legal, and it will be legal starting August 1st. And so we're going to bring on our first guests here, and if we can launch in Sam and Jake. Jake's joining us from a remote location, and Sam Pearce too. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on again. How you doing today?
Thanks for having us, Tony.
Great.
Sam, how's everything going for you out in Syracuse? Is it as warm there as it is here in Minnesota?
Other than having to admit to being a constituent of the aforementioned Charles Schumer, things are great.
And Jake, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit more about where you're broadcasting from right now and why you're there?
Well, I'm down in the best barbecue town in the United States in Kansas City, Missouri. And I was here today. I was participating in the Kansas City Heart Walk for the American Heart Association.
Nice.
And it is significantly warmer down here. It's high 80s and somewhat humid. So
can you talk about a little more about what that walk is benefiting, who it's benefiting, and the
Sure.
organization?
Yeah, it goes to funding, cures for heart disease, research behind it. It's personally touched my family. I had a nephew who was born last year and lived 9 months and died from a rare heart disease. And so, we participate as a family wearing shirts for him. And that's what I think a lot of marchers and walkers do, is they support someone that they know, a loved one that passed away or is currently fighting a heart disease or heart defect.
Well, it sounds like a great cause, and I'm glad you're out there, just bringing the energy and the attention to it. So thanks for that. Definitely. So we're just going to move to a video quick, and we're going to show the audience a video from earlier this week. Governor Dayton making the announcement that he's signing the bill into law for gay marriage in Minnesota. And it's a historic day. Wherever you fall on the issue, it's something that we should all be, just paying attention to. And I think still it's okay to talk about, too, as long as it's done in a respectful manner and that all viewpoints are respected on it. So with that, I'm going to line up this video here, see if I can do that. Whoops. Oops. All right, so here we go.
Our country's founding principle was stated 237 years ago in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That principle was later embodied in the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Unfortunately, our nation's founding fathers had bold aspirations, but bad implementation. They were wrongly denied those equal rights and protections to women, African Americans, and other racial minorities. They also left out GLBT men and women. If you believe, as I do, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness certainly include the right to marry the person you love.
Okay, so that is Governor Dayton making history at the Minnesota State Capitol. And gentlemen, I wanted to get your viewpoint on that, because I believe it's interesting that Governor Dayton is invoking the spirit of the United States Constitution. He's using the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and in other viewpoints. And then he also pointed out that the founders of the country, even though the founders of the country didn't work on the 14th Amendment, but I'm sure that's what he was referencing, but he said the founders of the country, that they had some things wrong. And that's something that you hear quite often from people on the left, is that the Constitution was somehow flawed, or the framers didn't really envision everybody. But Jake, isn't that still today, isn't that the law of the land? Isn't that where all our rights are actually granted from, as the U.S. Constitution? And did our founders have it wrong?
Well, rights aren't granted to us from a Constitution. They're granted to government from our Constitution. And there's certain enumerated powers given to government. And so it's really funny to me to hear a guy like a progressive like Governor Dayton actually use the Constitution, because that argument is just very vague when it comes to other laws, like enforcing Obamacare in the state of Minnesota, where he tends to forget about any enumerated powers and use the General Welfare Clause or Interstate Commerce Clause, or even let's go as far as using the taxing authority of Congress. So, you know, I think it's a little goofy that he would actually acknowledge the Constitution, but that's the typical way progressives work, is whenever it benefits them, they want to talk about the Constitution or think they can make that argument. But when it doesn't, i.e. the Second Amendment, then they pretend as if it's not there.
Sam, I want you to chime in, because you come to us every Saturday live from Syracuse, New York, and in the state of New York, same-sex marriage was legalized through the legislature. I think it was a couple years ago. And can you talk a little more about your experience living in the state of New York, and whether or not us people here in Minnesota, do people have things to worry about changes that are coming along the way?
Well, that's right, Tony. It's been 2 years. It was 2011, about this time 2 years ago. And in New York, like Minnesota, and probably like every state, I think I read that Minnesota is the 12th state now to legalize same-sex marriage. In New York, like all of those states, it was a big deal in the news, but it came and went. And I consider myself a fiscal conservative, but probably the farthest thing from a social conservative. So my opinion might be a little biased here, but I can't tell you how my life has changed, for better or worse. And when I think about the issue, even if I step away from the issue as far as equality and equal rights under the law, it just seems like such a non-issue to me as far as what matters in this country. So New York, like Minnesota, still has much too high of an unemployment rate. The state operates on a deficit almost every year for quite some time. There are so many problems, but gay marriage, to me personally, is not one of them, and I can't tell you how it changed my life. It's a non-issue here now.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about, can you talk a little more about, you think that there's other issues that the government should be dealing with. Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. Like I said, the states, especially the blue, what I would call the blue states, states in the Northeast, states in the upper Midwest, have all sorts of financial trouble right now. So to make these social issues like gay marriage such a big deal, and for that to eat up so much time and so many resources, to me seems almost irresponsible. I think you'd be really hard pressed to say allowing gay marriage has a negative financial impact on any state or on the country. I'd be willing to hear any argument to the contrary, but let me give you an example, Tony. So Obamacare, the healthcare initiative, I work for a large Fortune 500 company, and this past year, our benefits, the cost to our medical benefits, went up significantly. Not a little bit, but I'm talking a multiplier. And the HR representatives from the company, in a big company-wide conference call to go over benefits, they blame Obamacare. And is it partly scapegoat or is it partly true? And we challenged them on, some employees challenged them on that, and they said, well, we had all these 25, 24-year-old kids that came onto insurance. We have to pay for them somehow. Birth control's free. Guess what? It's not free. We have to pay for it. You're all going to pay for these things as a result of Obamacare. That's that's something that impacts the lives of thousands of people and families. Obamacare is starting to cause financial pain to people. Now, you can argue down the road, maybe it won't. Maybe it's going to work. But that's an issue that should be in the news. The costs that are now coming out of Obamacare. And that's something I would say that's an issue. Gay marriage, I challenge someone to point out how that has impacted people in a negative way.
Well, you talked about the news, and this last week, we talked about Benghazi a lot last Saturday. If you remember, we dedicated at least a third of the show to the scandal of Benghazi. We broke down some of the facts, and then slowly but surely, what emerged was this IRS scandal. The IRS coming out with an admission that it was targeting conservative, not-for-profit groups under the IRS scrutiny. And she specifically went out and said, and admitted, the IRS did, that they were going after groups with patriots in their name, and Tea Party, and groups that were studying or talked about the U.S. Constitution. These were the buzzwords for the scrutiny. And we're going to pull up a clip here, and then I'd love to get your guys' feedback on that. It's pretty amazing, though. Jon Stewart, and I don't always agree with Jon Stewart, but I believe that this piece that he put on, he hit the nail right on the head in terms of, just showing the hypocrisy and also validating some of the fears that great conservatives like President Ronald Reagan and others have voiced about fearing government. So with that, we're going to throw on this clip here and play it now.
What did you do? In the spring of 2010, just as the Tea Party movement was gaining steam, a group of IRS specialists were told to focus on organizations with, quote, political-sounding names seeking tax-exempt status. Political sounding, that could be anybody. Political sounding, that's not right way. It could be Hippies for Change or Occupy Ralph Nader. I mean, it's not necessarily just right wing. Groups with names like We the People or Take Back the Country. Okay, that's right wing. Specialists were told to be on the lookout for Tea Party applications, along with groups whose mission was to educate about the Constitution. Oh, okay, all right. In their defense, there is a good reason why people using the IRS to crack down on political enemies would not want Americans educated about the Constitution. And while the tax-exempt status that all political groups get is kind of bull, it's bull that should at least be granted fairly and equitably, spread around evenly, if you will. So unlike much of the Benghazi inquiry, this seems like a genuine scandal.
So explanation, please, let's say from the individual who oversees tax-exempt organizations for the IRS.
They used names like Tea Party or Patriots, and they selected cases simply because the application had those names in the title. That was wrong. The IRS would like to apologize for that.
Oh, okay, thank you. I appreciate. Wait a minute! I didn't realize apologies were sufficient in IRS-related issues. Hold on one minute. I bet, if I'm not mistaken, that right now, Wesley Snipes feels like a real ass. Wait, all I had to say was, I'm sorry. Instead of always bet on black, I should have just said, I'm sorry. And since we're talking about this, you know how on my taxes I put down that I have a farm? Actually, I had a salad. So, sorry. But don't worry, it gets funnier.
I said that about a quarter of the cases that were selected for full development had either Tea Party or Patriot in their name.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for the clarification, but that would be a quarter of the 300 then. So we're talking 75 or so?
That's correct. Is that a quarter? That's correct. Thank you. I'm not good at math.
That's a good one. That's a good one! Lady who works at the place that calculates people's taxes. Well, congratulations, President Barack Obama. Conspiracy theorists, who generally can survive in anaerobic environments, have just had an algae bloom dropped on their heads, thus removing the last arrow in your pro-governance quiver: skepticism about your opponents. Gun control. Why can't we have background checks?
I believe it would put us inexorably on the path to a national gun registry.
Oh, right. A national gun registry. The government's going to overreach, and there's going to be a registry, and the government's even capable of that kind of overreach, and they're going to take your guns away from you.
The Internal Revenue Service admitted today that some of its employees targeted conservative political groups.
Motherfuckers! This has, in one seismic moment, shifted the burden of proof from the tinfoil behatted to the government. The VA claims backlog and the bounced checks foreclosure cluster had already given government competence fetishists fits. Government competence fetishist fits. And now this. In a few short weeks, you've managed to show that when the government wants to do good things, your managerial competence falls somewhere between David Brent and a cat chasing a laser pointer. But when government wants to flex its more malevolent muscles, you're Iron Man! You know what? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm overreacting. I still believe, I really do, that good government has the power to improve people's lives, and that the people have the power to restrain its excesses. I forget that sometimes, and I'm sorry. It's going to be okay, and our form of government is bigger than just these issues. This storm will pass. It's just, really? Right now?
All right, we're just getting this into the Situation Room, calling it a, quote, massive and unprecedented intrusion. The Associated Press now saying the Justice Department secretly obtained 2 months of phone records of its reporters and editors.
Mother. We'll be right back.
So that's Jake, you with us now?
I certainly am.
Pretty amazing, isn't it?
I don't think I could put any better than that. No, it was a very interesting piece by Jon Stewart. Let me read a little piece from the Declaration of Independence, one of the most important documents of our founding. And this is what they alleged towards the tyrant overseas. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. It's so interesting to me that, what was it, a week or two ago, Obama was at Ohio State University?
Yeah, Ohio
and acted
State.
like guys like myself, who I'm the executive director of the Tea Party PAC here in the state of Minnesota. Guys like me who are afraid of government growing too big and becoming tyrannical, that we're crazy, don't listen to us, and yet in the same week we have done something that was accused towards the King of England over 200 years ago. It still happens today. It's something that we always believe is a threat to liberty, is that the fact that the federal government grows too big and infringes on our liberty more and more by the day. And this is a clear-cut example of what we've been talking about.
Sam, do you want to chime in there?
Well, I think the Stewart piece was good, and aside from the comedy, he's right in that what better way to galvanize the conservative base against you than to give them this kind of ammunition. So it's troubling at best, and just downright infuriating at worst. And I'm sure, Tony, you want to get into a lot of the different ramifications about the IRS scandal, but just the fact that you can be and I hate to make a joke of it, but it's, it's just kind of comical. So the big government career bureaucrats want to target the groups that say, hey, government is too big and you're taxing us too much, and we're going to be outrageously and obnoxiously obvious with it. It's almost just too much to believe.
It is, and another person, to bring it to a more local aspect, and I mentioned it at the beginning of the show, but Senator Al Franken is starting to get some heat about this IRS scandal, and there's no evidence, I want to be clear, that shows that he's directly involved or in any way told people at the IRS to target conservative groups or Tea Party groups. What he does have on the record, though, is a letter that he signed, an official letter that he signed with U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer, Jeff Merkley, Michael Bennett, and Tom Udall, Gene Shaheen, and Sheldon Whitehouse. So Senator Al Franken signed this. He was one of the main signers. And this is a letter, and this was reported in the Star Tribune, but there were letters to the former Internal Revenue Service Commissioner Douglas Schulman in February 2012, asking whether the IRS intended to investigate social welfare organizations that they said engaged in a substantial or even a predominant amount of campaign activity. So basically, they're urging an investigation into these groups called social welfare groups or not-for-profits, and saying that they're engaging in federal campaign activity, which is a pretty ambiguous term to basically describe free speech and freedom of association. But they're actually using the power of their seat and their position to try to stifle this type of activity amongst private groups, private organizations, and private money. Jake, do you think there's a story here, or do you think this is just Schumer and Franken acting here and the IRS scandal acting somewhat separate? Jake?
Here's the story, Tony. The story is that these guys use the welfare clause in the Constitution to apply to just about anything under the sun. But when it comes to the 501c4 nature of welfare, it has got to be so specific that a Tea Party group possibly couldn't be part of it. But no, to be honest with you, I don't see much of a scandal or anything here, because what they were doing is just broadly define it. And here's why this happens, and maybe some of your audience doesn't understand how this works. When an organization wants to get a bunch of money into politics and not have to disclose their donors, they usually start up a 501c4 organization. It's a social welfare organization. It's a backdoor way of bringing big corporate contributions into the political realm without actually having to make that reportable to either a state campaign finance board or the FEC if it's a federal election. So that's part of the reason with these 501c4s.
Does it give the people who donate to these not-for-profits a tax write-off? Can they write that off?
501c4s are different than C3s.
Okay.
A write-off is for a 501c3 organization. These are just separate codes in the IRS tax code, which is thousands of pages long. A 501c4 by nature is not something that can be written off. However, it's something that actually can be used for political purposes directly, where a 501c3 could not be.
Interesting. Well, one guy who did make news was another U.S. Senator, Max Baucus, and of course he's a Democrat. And he's recently made news because he's starting to predict that Obamacare is going to turn into an unmitigated disaster, and he's on his way out from the U.S. Senate. So he's been speaking freely a lot more and really being somewhat critical on the Obama administration, on Obamacare, and other things that are coming out of the Democratic National Party. But he said in an interview that he has a hunch that a lot more is going to come out of this whole IRS scandal, he says. And he said it's broader than the current focus. And he says, I think it's important that we have hearings. He said, I think that we have to encourage other information to come out that has not yet come out. He says that I suspect that we will learn more in the next several days, maybe the next 3 weeks, which adds more context to all of this. And he goes on and basically talking about tax reform and some other things. But I want to know, and Sam or Jake, I don't know if you guys know a little more about this, but what exactly is the IRS? What's the relationship with the IRS to the federal government? Is it under the executive branch, or is it part of the Treasury? Or can you clear that up a little bit?
Well, the Treasury is part of the executive branch, and it falls under the Treasury. So I believe the IRS chief actually answers directly to the Treasury Secretary.
That's right.
So,
okay, go.
Do you think? There tends to be, there's some people saying that this might be a bigger issue than even meets the eye. And I mean, Sam, do you think that President Obama himself could be directly involved in influencing the IRS to scrutinize these Tea Party and conservative groups?
Yes and no. Quick thing that I wanted to share with your audience before I forget. So earlier this week, there was a writer who sarcastically put out a tweet that said, SEAL Team 6 reports directly to President Obama. No other government agencies do. and the writer was getting at the Obama administration will take credit for the good, and let's face it, killing Osama bin Laden is better than good. It's great, but it's also maybe their only crowning achievement. Everything else that goes wrong, the president has nothing to do with. Here's why I think. If you're halfway intelligent, here's how I think you have to take that. So, conservatives, who I think will be galvanized by a lot of this, say, hey, government is too big. It's a monstrosity. It's just, and it's growing and it's getting worse and it's too big. And the Obama administration would say, no, reject those voices, I think was what he said at Ohio State. But then they also say, the government's so big, President Obama and this administration can't possibly oversee, what's the evils, or that's a strong word, but the wrongdoing with the IRS. Well, which one is it? Are your conservative opponents right that government has gotten too big? Or if it hasn't, then who's going to oversee them? If not the White House and the executive branch of government, then who? You can't have it both ways. You can't say big government's good, but then also say no one's accountable when something goes wrong because the government's too big. I think that's a conundrum that conservatives have to present and question the White House on. And I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't just fear a big federal government because I believe it's corruptible and therefore we could go down the wrong path because we were following the wrong leader, the wrong people, the people that don't have the interest of liberty in mind. but the sheer incompetence of a government outside of, let's just take it from a federalist issue or federalism issue where the state of Minnesota, now we hand off our healthcare decisions and our tax decisions, stuff like that out to Washington, D.C. It's just not capable of being any bit of efficient if it's someone out in Washington, D.C., whereas if we localized government, brought it back to the state of Minnesota, and that's where the majority of our government was, we'd be better off.
See, and I think my take on this IRS scandal, and I want to know, if you guys agree with me or disagree, but I think this is smoke and mirrors. The IRS actually came out, and they were the ones who broke the story. Even though President Obama said that it was leaked, it was the IRS that came out and actually broke the story to the press. Go ahead.
Tony,
Yeah.
Did you read about how they planted the question when the IRS woman got asked about it? The IRS actually planted the question in the crowd at the event that she was speaking at to make sure that this was brought up. So I don't know if your viewers know about that or got a chance to read about that, but not only did the IRS get it out, but they actually had a journalist was tipped off to ask the question.
That's I have not heard about that, but it doesn't surprise me at all. And I think that what I'm trying to get at here is the smoke and mirrors part is they're specifically targeting Tea Partiers. They're specifically targeting conservative groups. You have the IRS that doesn't do anything, as you pointed out, Sam. I don't think they do anything unintentionally. They intentionally brought this story out there. Huge story, covered everywhere in the mainstream media. People are starting to forget about the whole Benghazi scandal. And I believe at the end of the day, this is Democratic national politics calculus at work. This is
can
them.
I comment on that real quick, Tony?
Yeah.
I think the reason that the issue was brought up was because it was nearing the end of a Inspector General report, and so therefore it's typical where the agency would admit to any wrongdoing because it's coming out anyhow in the Inspector General report. So that's why I believe the IRS came out with it. I think the broader issue here, though, is a discussion about why we have federal agents that get to look at the paperwork of individuals inside the states. I mean, the founders would never envision our country ever engaging in that kind of practice. I mean, after all, the Fourth Amendment says that the people are supposed to be secure in their paperworks and effects. How are you secure in your paperworks and effects when a federal agency can come in and ask you what your bank account is, how much money you made this year, what did you put in your retirement account? That's not privacy. That is actually against the Constitution.
Not to mention they can tap directly into your paycheck every single 2 weeks or every month or whatever,
Right.
and take out your withholdings and put them into who knows what type of an account.
Right, that's property because you provided labor and just compensate, and you receive compensation, and they can have a claim to that compensation, which is essentially your property. So yeah, that's a very valid point. And now with Obamacare, they'll also know what health policy you have, which is a reportable event to the IRS.
And then going back to my point too, though, of how I believe this is Democratic strategery at play here is they're making a calculus. The Democrats know who their base is. They understand who their base is and what motivates their base. And when you have the government coming out saying that they're specifically targeting conservative groups and anti-tax groups, I guarantee you that there is a large, substantial chunk of people, even right here in Minnesota, probably the majority, that in the back of their heads, they're thinking good. Right. They should go after these Tea Party groups. They should go after these anti-tax groups. The fact that they're anti-tax from the very first place is enough justification for them to be investigated by the IRS. So the IRS is actually doing their job. It's like when somebody commits a crime and posts it on YouTube, it's like, well, duh, you just committed your crime and you post it on YouTube, you're going to get caught and prosecuted for that. Same thing with this. And, and that's why I pointed out U.S. Senator Al Franken, coming out and this, being associated with the IRS and encouraging the IRS to, at least do more investigation into political groups that are involved in federal campaigns. His base and the base in Minnesota are thinking to themselves, good. It's like the Saul Lewinsky, the rules for radicals. If you read that, one of the rules is the ends justify the means. And so when you have as big of a base as the Democrats do, and these types of tactics, I believe it plays into their base. Sam, do you agree with me or disagree with me?
Yeah, and a couple of things. So yesterday's Wall Street Journal, Kimberly Strassel, really talented writer, wrote a piece about did the IRS get direction from the White House? And she said, absolutely, of course they did. And she said, now if you're a Republican and you're on a witch hunt looking for evidence that he picked up the phone and called the IRS and said, here's what I want you to do, you won't find it. But here's how he goes about it. If you spend 3 years preaching incessantly about the evils of your opponents, then ultimately those that work for you in other parts of the government will follow up on that. And okay, so who could that be? It could be the IRS, and it could also be people like Senators Schumer and the others. And I want you to think back to about the time that Schumer co-authored that letter. Do you remember in the news when Senator Schumer, not knowing that there were reporters on a conference call, was going on and on about how, remember, he was talking to other leadership in the Democratic Party, and he was saying, remember, whenever we talk about them, we've got to paint them as extremists, got to talk about them as extremists. And it was a big deal because I think Fox News and some other outlets got a hold of it, and they were playing it. And then when Schumer realized that there were reporters on the call, it just went dead. He hung up. I don't know if you guys remember that story, but it was about a year ago when that letter was authored. So if President Obama just preaches over and over again about the evils of his opposition, then he doesn't have to make an official phone call to the IRS or to a senator in Minnesota or New York, but eventually they'll do the dirty work for him. And I think that's the new political way to go about this, is let's pursue indirectly, let's take leadership from the president on how to go about attacking our enemies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we seem to have lost Jake somewhere along the way. I don't know if his connection went out like Schumer's, but maybe we'll get him back.
Do you remember that, Tony?
Yes, I do remember. Was that right around February of 2012?
And I think that was about the same time frame as when Schumer got, literally caught off guard on that conference call when he was talking about the need to, how important what he said. And do you remember he said, they keep telling us we've got to paint them as extremists. Remember, whenever you talk about them, talk about how extreme the Republicans are and how they're preventing anything from getting done. So when Schumer said that, who's they? Who's they that was telling Schumer to tell others, got to portray these people as extremists that need to be investigated, perhaps? It's a culture that has taken over, and it's pretty obvious to me.
Huh? And Sam, we have a phone call right now, so we're gonna bring on the caller.
Okay.
Hello,
Tony.
Hello, caller.
Tony, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, I got a couple questions on, not questions and comments on Dayton's statement about equal protections of the law. Does that mean I can now marry my sister since the basis of marriage is now who you love? And since she's a woman and I'm a man, wouldn't that be equal protection? Or can I marry my brother now? So I think their equal protection argument falls because each state can have its own values, can establish a state religion or state morals. I mean, every law that is passed is a state morality. It is based on a moral implications. And then that's what the homosexuals are saying. This is moral that we get to marry. I mean, that's their argument. But to Sam's particular statement about how has this affected my life? And the implication is it's not going to affect my life. Yet what we see with the issue of it has and it will affect a person's life. Grandparents will not be able to have grandkids unless a homosexual couple takes these grandkids from somebody else. And so it will affect over the long term. And even with redefining marriage already to have no-fault divorce affects marriages, it affects kids, it affects their social structure. This will now be taught in the schools as this is the norm, and it will affect the kids that go to the government religious schools. So I would just like that.
Yeah, well, if you could stay with us, caller, I'd like to address some of the questions, and I am curious because Sam, who's with us right now, he's fiscal conservative, and he says he's more socially liberal, and he said, you mentioned how he was talking about in New York, how the gay marriage laws there haven't really affected him either way. So first, Sam, can you answer the caller's question? You said, does the equal protection, should people have the right to marry their brother or their sister or first cousin or can you comment on that?
Wow, tough question. And I thank the caller for call. I'm sorry I didn't catch his name, but I thank the caller for calling in. This is a good discussion. I don't know off the top of my head what the state. So let's take Minnesota, New York, any of the states. I don't know what the state law says about incestual relationships, Tony. I believe most states.
It's prohibited. In current law or current statute law lists prohibited marriages in Minnesota, and it includes marrying your siblings. It's illegal to marry your first cousin in Minnesota, and then same-sex marriage was prohibited under the same group of statutes. So probably the same as New York.
So the way I would interpret the law now in a state that allows same-sex marriage is if brother and sister can't get married, and then I would assume brother and brother can't get married, right?
That's right.
So,
but the argument though is still the same. It's the argument is who you love and who you care about, and so by that rationale, which is the only rationale in the argument, the equal protection really isn't there because it doesn't apply to the marriage issue. Equal protection is already there in the law for a gay person. A gay person gets to marry. A homosexual gets to marry, but it has to be the opposite sex. So they have that protection. And that's why the equal protection argument is just fallacious.
Whoops. Jake. Have you been paying attention to our conversation, Jake?
I haven't.
I'm just so surprised to see you now because I was talking to Sam just about 2 seconds ago. I'm sorry. And then all of a sudden you pop up and now I'm talking to you. So I was just a little taken back by that. What happened?
Technology can't always work for us, can it?
No, and thank God that it's a warm day in Minnesota and it was raining this morning, so I'm sure most people aren't watching right now anyways. Thanks for joining us, Jake.
Yep, definitely.
Hey, I want to change topics pretty abruptly here because of the circumstance we're finding ourselves in. And you're on a still frame, by the way, with a great smile. So if that's how it's going to be, that's totally fine.
Okay.
But I want to talk about the jobs numbers that recently came out for April in Minnesota. The spring week's arrival, people are blaming this and they're blaming that and they're blaming other things on the jobs numbers. And 11,400 jobs essentially That was the net loss of jobs in Minnesota. That puts Minnesota actually lower than the national average in terms of job creation.
Sure.
This is pretty alarming, actually. And Steve Hine, he is the director of the state's Labor Market Information Office, and he said that there's several influences with the job numbers. One of the influences is they blame the weather. April was a terrible month in terms of the weather and everything. So, they blame the weather for one. And the other thing that they blamed was, let's see if we got them here. The other thing that they blamed were cold weather and the seasonal hiring at parks and golf courses. They said last year the weather was better. The road and bridge construction projects added 3,400 jobs in April. This year, the month showed a gain of just 1,300. They said, but the job losses were spread over a bunch of different sectors, including the financial activities. They lost 400 jobs, and manufacturing, and then state government. So the other big factor that they blamed was the sequester, which is still into effect to this day and still going on to it. And Sam, I see you here right now. Are you able to hear us, Sam?
I can hear you. I don't know what happened. I got cut off on the call.
We don't know yet either. I think we're experiencing some technical difficulties with the connection either here or there. So we're not really quite sure exactly what happened. But you were making some points about the marriage thing, and then we got cut off, and essentially Jake all of a sudden appeared on the screen where you were. And,
okay.
Jake was gone for a while, and so I was pretty surprised to see that. And then we started talking about some other things. So.
Minimize the app and try and call Jake back in, because when he calls in.
Okay, so we're gonna try to we're gonna see if we can somehow get Jake back in here.
It's an amateur hour at the Tony Hernandez show, isn't it?
Jake, are you back? Jake, we can hear you, but we can't see you. Usually it's the other way around for you, isn't it?
Yeah, that's fine. If you want me to answer or respond to what you were saying about the job numbers here in Minnesota, it is not a good picture. There's been this trend for the last 5 years in the United States, which shows that regardless of what unemployment numbers do, we have this trend towards a smaller participation of people in the labor force as there are in the non-institutional workforce. And so that means what generally that means is the people that could be in the labor force are participating less than have in the last, I think, decade or even a couple decades. Now, the factors behind that could be many things. It could be a demographic trend right now, a demographic trend of women now trying to stay at home with kids more than, had been seen in the last 10, 20 years. But another thing that I would allude to is that there was a lot of people that were in the workforce and no longer could find jobs, got demotivated and completely left the workforce and are no longer receiving any kind of government assistance, and so therefore they would be tracked, and that could be something like an early retirement, which I think with the baby boom generation could be pretty widespread.
Yeah, in my job in the mortgage business, I talk to dozens and dozens of homeowners every single day in Minnesota, and sometimes I got to catch myself from feeling too downtrodden because I hear story after story of people being backwards on their mortgage or losing a job at some point or having to rack up a significant amount of debt or co-signing student loans for their kids and not having their debt-to-income ratios in line, the whole works. And it's pretty obvious to me that despite record low interest rates and despite massive spending efforts by the Federal Reserve and the federal government, that the economy is just not cranking the way that it felt like it used to, in the 90s
Yeah, and let me put it to you this way. I mean, let's say that the Fed creates $1 million new dollars overnight, all right? And let's say that $1 million goes to the hiring of 10 new people, whatever job in industry, or maybe it's widespread jobs in industries. So there's 10 new jobs, but this $100 million or this $1 million is created out of thin air. It had no wealth or substantial stakes behind it. Is the economy any better now that there's 10 new jobs created from money created out of thin air? The answer to that question is really no, and that's somewhat of what you're seeing in the United States. The issue with that is we're not even getting those 10 new jobs, not to the extent that we should if we were hoping to get to a full recovery. So I would answer your question with no. What the government's intrusion in the marketplace is doing is not helping us out, regardless, even if we were creating jobs.
What about you, Sam? I mean, what do you see in your industry, and what do you see locally in the state of New York and Syracuse? I mean, do you get the feeling that things are getting better and we're on a path to prosperity, or what are your feelings about it?
No, not really. State of New York, I do have to say, has the lowest business tax rate that it's had in 50 or 60 years. I think going back to like World War II era. So there's some good being done within the state, but on the aggregate, quick point that I wanted to make. If you remember around the time of the election last year, the Obama administration was really pushing, hey, things are getting better. Things are getting better. Look, the unemployment rate keeps dropping steadily. And Jake was talking about, all right, well, what jobs are being created. One thing that the Romney campaign did a horrible job with is they didn't shed enough light on the fact that in the first 4 Obama years, the median household income in this country dropped by $4,000. I think from about $56,000 a year to $52,000. That is terrible. It'd be terrible if it stayed the same. It dropped by about $1,000 a year on average. So even as the unemployment rate falls, and Jake has talked at length about and done a really good job explaining the labor participation rate, which explains some of it. Also, some of the jobs in the service industry that are being created just aren't that good at jobs. So, Tony, you talked about decades prior, and I think that's a good point, that even as certain jobs come back, a lot of them are part-time or less than full-time, and we could do another show on Obamacare and how that is forcing employers to put people on 28-hour work weeks. But that median household income figure, I think, is quite revealing.
Yeah, and Jake, are you still with us, Jake?
Yeah, I mean, to expand on what Sam was saying, even if those jobs, were somewhat making a rebound, but people's income per capita were staying level, or as Sam just said, which is a great point, we had a drop in income. That's still bad when you consider the fact in the economy, the prices of consumer goods has gone up in the last many years. I mean, we are not filling up the tank of gas anywhere close to what we were 5 years ago. And we're not buying food anywhere close to the prices we were buying 5 years ago. So that's all another important part of why our current state of affairs in this economy are not good.
And I think we're going to talk the last 5 minutes of our show about this, but I think we're on the brink, or I think we are on the precipice of a major change or movement coming out into America. And I'm not talking about something that's going to happen in a matter of weeks or a matter of months, but I believe that over the next 5 to 10 to 20 years, we are going to see the next great American movement. And in particular, what I believe what we're going to see is we're going to actually see families uprooting and migrating to new areas within the United States. And they're going to flock to states and regions where there are more job opportunities. Some of these families are going to flock to the big city areas where there's more government welfare, perhaps, or things that they can take advantage of with that. You're going to see conservatives and libertarian-oriented people moving to regions where they're not implementing Obamacare, where there is somewhat of a resemblance of a free market healthcare system where they can pay for their health care out of pocket or through their health savings accounts rather than having to be forced into the state exchange or the national exchange. And I want to know what you guys think, because I'm about to have a child here, you know, and like I'm starting to really think more and more about where are we heading to?
Tony, it's already happening. That migration is already happening.
It is, and I've had my brother's father-in-law moved his business down to Texas a couple years ago from Minnesota. But I'll just give you a quick case in point here in the state of Minnesota, and I might be part of this boat in the next couple of years, depending on where we go. A guy like me could be taxed over 50% between my federal and state income taxes alone. I'm a financial advisor, okay, and I own my own business. So between federal and state income taxes, it's over 30% for myself. Then you tag on another 15% I pay in FICA, because I don't pay just the 7.65, I pay the whole amount. FICA is your Social Security Medicare taxes, by the way. So you tack that on, that's 45%. And then the state of Minnesota now is, I believe in the final DFL tax plan, wants to tax my service industry, and that would be at about a 6% tax rate. And so here you tack on another 6%, and I can't pass that on to consumer because I have clients in other states, and I have to compete with other state advisors. So essentially that's another 6% tax on top of the 35% I pay. I mean, now I'm over 51%. You can't tell me why I want to stay in Minnesota when I'm already paying through the roof on taxes.
And Sam, you talked about, you said this is already happening. You said people are moving. Can you expand a little more about that?
Yep, quickly, because I know we're short on time. If you can go look up statistics on growth, Tony, and the growth is taking place in states like Texas that Jake mentioned, the Dakotas, Kansas, South Carolina, I think both of the Carolinas actually, and the states that are not experiencing growth are places in the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, the Rust Belt, because they still have such big, large bureaucratic governments and hefty tax rates. So there are several states in the country now, in the South, the Plains states out west, where the income tax rate is 0 or next to 0. And corporate tax rates are very low. So if you go look up growth, Tony, and read about places like North Dakota versus places like, say, Providence, Rhode Island, which is on the verge of bankruptcy and just clinging to its big, giant government, bad liabilities, big public union pension problems, you can read about the migrations that are taking place and where the growth exists and where it doesn't.
Yeah, that's a good point. And people will always say, well, they're not going to leave this great state. Like, for instance, Minnesota. You hear politicians say it. Minnesota is a great place to live. There's no doubt about it. Great neighborhoods, great schools, and you get the lakes and the whole deal. And they're like, well, why would anyone want to move to North Dakota? It's just a bunch of dirt and oil there. But as people become more and more desperate, as the debt loads become higher and higher, and fathers and mothers are being forced with decisions of, I can either live in this great neighborhood with all these great parks, and they got all-day daycare, and they got unionized child care, they got every government program you could possibly imagine, but no jobs, or they can go somewhere where they can live relatively cheap, get a great paying job, access to health care, and money in the bank. Ultimately, that's what people are going to decide. And that's the end of our show right now. We're coming to the end, and may God bless you, may God bless America, and vaya con Dios.